At the BAM Center in last October 29th, we did a Truth and Reconciliation Summit that was amazing. I mean, Marie Wilson was there, one of the commissioners who presented some of the truth. Phil Fontaine was there, of course, who helped negotiate this whole movement and so on. And they both talked about how great of an event it was. Because what we did there is we had about 300 people, almost all of which, about 230 of which were from the region. So this is the town of Banff, town of Canmore, just outside the park, Lake Louise area, to Exshaw and a little village, and right to Stony, the Morley, Stony Nakota Nation. And you would not believe the community, the response for them to show up and be interested in conversations about what they can do. But the result of that, we're about a few months later, and the connections with the Morley community that are happening are amazing. The schools, the Parks Canada, all these community foundations and many other organizations building these relationships with and bringing their services to the Stony Nakota communities, including the other Treaty 7 communities as well, but definitely with the Stony Nakota, which are really close to the park. So just wanted to share that we had an amazing event there. There will be a report that will be available to the public next month, so you're all welcome to see what we captured from that event, so that can help you as well. And we are designing a pilot program for this fall in October, where it is primarily for a non-Indigenous audience to have an experience of a truth and reconciliation. If you take that summit experience we had in one day, spread out over 3.5 days, so that people can really be engaged in how they can carry on reconciliation efforts in their community. So I'd like to introduce Reneltta Arluk is an artistic director of Mattituck Theatre, and I'd like to introduce Sarah Garton Stanley, who is the Associate Artistic Director of English Theatre and the Interim Facilitator of Indigenous Theatre at the National Arts Centre. Alan Greyeyes, who is the Indigenous Music Development Manager with Manitoba Music. Miche le Stanners, who's the Executive Director of the Making Treaty 7 project. Maybe I'll ask Alan and Reneltta, if an arts organization, or really any organization, is interested in partnering or collaborating with Indigenous musicians or theater artists, what expectations would you have to respond to that organization as they approached you, and maybe the way they engage you?
That's a great question. Right now, in about 3 days, I'll be heading to Stratford to direct The Breathing Hole there by Colleen Murphy. I believe I'm the first Indigenous person to be directing at Stratford. And I think it was, when I was asked, I was first asked as, what do you think, would you be interested? Not like, we're going to choose you and you're going to do it. I think you have to, one thing that's been really beautiful about working with Anthony is that he's generous and he's open, and because he is, the organization is. So when you talk about governance, that is governance, because it does go from the top down. And so when that conversation began, he sent me the draft, and we read it. I read it at home, and I said, I think we could go forward with this, Anthony. I think that this is a beautiful play. And then we engaged in process. Now there have been hiccups because you have to follow a machine, that's Stratford, and then you have to go with the process that is Indigenous creation. And so we've definitely had some moments where deadlines met before process, and then we had to retract that, we had to negotiate the conflicts that comes with, and then go forward again with more process. But what's been really beautiful about this is that each time we come up to those conflicts, it isn't a bully. It isn't a, like, we have to do this. It's a, what should we do, Reneltta? Who can we engage with? What do you think would be the best step? And each time for me, it's about going into the community. I'm very community-based as an artist. I'm very community-based as just as an Indigenous person. So for me, everything has to go back into what does the community engage with. So when it came to the very basic fundamentals of costume design, how do we create Inuit costume design with a non-Inuk costume designer? Well, we bring in an Inuit costume designer to work with our costume designer, Joanna Yu. How do we engage props? How do we make these props? Well, let's ask Kuzi Curley, who's a carver, to come in and engage with the props department. How do we engage with language? Well, let's go to the community where the language is inspired from, or the area that the story is inspired from. Let's bring the story north and workshop the script in Iqaluit, and meet with an organization that's really strong and powerful, that has a voice, and have their voice be heard. This is very important because as a storyteller, I myself am a storyteller, I always acknowledge from where my stories come from. And I always acknowledge that I've been given that story by that person. And if you look at it on a greater scheme, you always have to acknowledge and bring the story to where it's inspired. And so it's always process, and it's vital. And I think one thing that Stratford has really learned is that they're like, okay, we made a mistake, or we jumped ahead too far. Let's go back and let's re-engage into the process. And it's been very good, and it's been positive. I mean, it has been challenging, but everything is challenging, and it has to be challenging because this is reconciliation. So when you have pushback, you have to acknowledge the fact that you're creating space that you've never invited voices to come in before. So when they have a pushback, or when we have a pushback, or I have a pushback, it's because I now have had space created where I can voice myself. I can voice my concerns. I can voice what I felt has been voiceless before. It's not an easy process, but it's a necessary process. And what has been wonderful is the generosity and the engagement and the walking side by side, or walking behind and allowing other leaders, Indigenous leaders, to come forth and have that voice. So that has been an incredible opportunity to be humble, and to be engaging, and to constantly learn. I have a hard time talking about the work that I do because I feel like I'm constantly learning, because I'm constantly in these engagements where I learn from my peers all of the time, and it's humbling. So I think the generosity and the humbleness is a key element to engaging community. One of the other major things I would suggest is curiosity. I sit on many arts council juries. I sit on Canada Council, I've sat on BC Arts Council, I sit on Vancouver City Arts Council. And in every single one of those mandates is diversity. But I will be really honest, I can see diversity for money, and I can see diversity for curiosity. And it is structural. And that's one of the first things that I tell the council to pass along is, don't just hire actors on your stage, put them in your board, because it's all about perspective, and you have to include a diverse perspective from the top down to really affect change for when those actors hit the stage. It is constantly breaking down the power structure, which I think is also something that you suggested with the TRC. So those are my two things, is it humbleness, openness, and curiosity. And don't be afraid to make mistakes, because you're going to. and that's okay. You know, I make mistakes, and I'm Indigenous. It's like we all make mistakes. It's okay.
Thank you. Alan?
Hello. So I think we need more stars. Like in the Indigenous music community, we need more stars on stage. We need more stars in the boardrooms. We need more stars applying for funding and running those funding programs. And so I'd just like to encourage everybody to provide opportunities for Indigenous people and provide mentorship and capacity building activities. We need more money for programming, definitely. And also, like I said earlier, plans for growing your programs if you are pursuing Indigenous arts or Indigenous programming. Also, the third thing that I think we need in order to develop more stars is a willingness to educate funders. And not all funders are going to be like the Canada Council, where there's a priority to support Indigenous arts. We need the ability to educate corporate sponsors and funders that the Indigenous music community or the Indigenous arts community isn't going to have the same multipliers as you know, like communities that have been developed and have multiple generations of leaders within them. Especially if you're going to approach the Indigenous audience, it's going to take a lot more money, and so you're going to need a lot more resources, and there's not going to have that same multiplier effect for this generation. I'm a firm believer that real change happens over generations, and so I think it's going to take a longer term investment in order to make real change within our community. And the second point is really, I think we are the arts, and it's our job to make the world a better place, and we need to do that by challenging stereotypes. And I think, like, if I can ask you all or challenge you all to do that by programming Indigenous artists, not only within Indigenous acts, but within all parts of your programming. Because as a young person, for me to see an Indigenous person on television or an Indigenous person on the news, or an Indigenous person on stage, it's extremely impactful. It has a lot of impact. And my daughters are 5 and 6. They don't see that a lot. But my 5-year-old, when we went to see Moana, which is, I don't know how many people have seen Moana, but it's a brown girl. It's a story about a brown girl, and my 5-year-old daughter, after the movie was done, she danced in the movie theater for like the 4 or 5 songs after the movie was done, because we don't have that ability to sympathize with Indigenous or people of like characters that are colored. And so if you can provide that experience, not only within your Indigenous programming, but within all of your programming, I think that's extremely important.
Thank you. Sure.
Very briefly, because I didn't mention this, most organizations, you know, where indigenizing will have maybe 1 or 2 Indigenous people on their board. We have 75% of our board is Indigenous, so it's Indigenous-led. We have 75% of the cast is Indigenous, or even more. And how did Michael do that? Like Reneltta said, he went out, worked with Michelle Thrash and Troy Twig, and they went to the community and they found the Indigenous artists, and they helped, they created with Blake Brooker from, you know, Michelle and Blake co-directed that first show. They're co-directing the show that's coming up. In many ways, it's Indigenous, but Michael also wanted it to be collaborative because he understood that we have so much to learn from each other, right? So if we can have an Indigenous and non-Indigenous at every level of the organization, we have the opportunity, because one of the great, so many tragedies of colonization, and one was that we as settlers, I don't think ever thought we had anything to learn from Indigenous people. Like, that is so sad, and we've got so much to learn for the very survival of the species, just an understanding of land. And it's Mother's Day. Indigenous people, the land is the mother. So while you're thinking of your mother, think of the land today too.
Keep that close. So I'm going to ask you, Michelle, first, and Sarah as well. So what would you provide, maybe from your experience in the projects you've worked on, some advice on you know, how those connections were made, and maybe you know, it is tough work. We can all attest to that. So if there's something you want to impart on the audience.
Well, someone mentioned pace. You know, to really try to embrace and work with the Indigenous way of knowing, pace is critical. It's a different pace. And you just talked about it when you were working with Stratford. What is it like, those of you on boards? You have AGMs, you have quarterly meetings, we have deadlines, Canada Council, deadlines, reporting deadlines, budgets, and that does not align necessarily with the pace at which Indigenous people may want or be able to work. And Robert Lepage talked about it yesterday, 4-year projects. Wouldn't that be great if we could be on that kind of timeline instead? But, so you're balancing between, well, we've got to make this deadline, sign here, or maybe we just have to let that one go and do more planning and reach consensus and make sure we have it right, do it right before moving on. So there's a whole question of space or pace, space, Indigenous ways of understanding the land and where the stories come from. In our case also, when you see that show, every word, every line, every note is written by the artists, inspired by the elders. That's why it took 3 years to do, and that's why it's so powerful. So pace is one thing I think we really have to wrap our minds around, a different sense of timeline.
Thank you. Sarah?
Hello. Great. On Wednesday night in Ottawa at the NAC, a reconciliation table, which was supported by this organization called The Circle, which is a philanthropic organization for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Candy Pomater hosted it, and she shared what Mi'kmaq writer Daniel Paul wrote in the foreword to his book, We Were Not the Savages. He said, Canada will never have peace in its soul until we deal with the pain of our past. So I take from that the stories that have been shared in the history of Indigenous performance give us all access to understanding the pain of our past. So from my perspective, it's not only right to produce more Indigenous work, I believe in doing so, we'll see the salvation of this country. And I also, these are things I wanted to say earlier, so thank you for the segue. I just wanted to bring forward a quote from Donna Michelle St. Bernard, who's an MC, a playwright, and a performer out of Toronto, who's had a long history working with Indigenous performers. She worked at Native Earth Performing Arts for a while. A terrific quote. She said, here's another thing. It's just not possible to get permission from a culture. That being said, you will have to ask. And permission is one of those things that is absolutely essential at every step. But to expect that you can get a grand blanket of permission is incorrect. It's person to person, and that's why time is such an incredibly potent value within this work.
Thank you. I'm now going to open it to questions for any of the panelists or for Mike again. On any thoughts and questions there's a lady over here.
Thank you. Hi. Hello? Hello, there we are. I'm Kate Proctor, and I'm from the Ottawa Little Theatre, and I'm one of the invited delegates here, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for Business for the Arts for this opportunity to hear and be part of this discussion, so I thank you for that. It's funny, I ran into Reneltta last night, and she got a hug, but she wasn't, I don't think, expecting. So she was very gracious. I thought she was someone else that I knew, and so she's a great hugger. I'll just mention that to start. So Reneltta's up for hugs. But I find the conversation very interesting, and I wanted to I was going to speak with Reneltta after this, because at the Ottawa Little Theatre, we have a one-act playwriting national competition, and we've just finished our 76th rendition of that. The Ottawa Little Theatre itself, we're going into our 105th season this coming September. But I thought when Alan was talking about stars, and I thought here's a great opportunity for not only the Indigenous community, but perhaps particularly the Indigenous community, to participate in playwriting and come into that competition. It's something that I had on my agenda to let people know about here, that this is an opportunity for playwrights to get their work out there. It's for emerging playwrights, it's for productions that have not been produced yet. And it's one act, it's not your full production, but it can be. And it's something that the Ottawa Little Theatre, we have 3 winners that we announce. And generally, but not always, the winner, we then take on to the EODL, which is the Eastern Ontario Drama League Festival. And so there's the opportunity for that work to then be produced within the same year that it could potentially be a winner. So I just wanted to share that for some potential stars from both your community and for anyone in the other arts organizations that are here. If you're interested in becoming part or partnering with me on that and the Ottawa Little Theatre, I welcome the opportunity, because I do want to spread the word on that to give more playwrights opportunities to get their work into the supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could suggest one thing that's really, when you're building community or you're asking a community to engage, it takes a bit of groundwork. It's not just an email and a phone call. It's going to the communities that you want to engage. So if you are looking for playwrights or you're looking for people to apply to your programming, not just your programming, but all programming, and you're feeling like there's a little bit of a gap there, go to the communities, attend functions that you see that are there, find out if there's Indigenous organizations, call them and ask them, or go there and ask them if they can recommend anyone to you personally. It really is groundwork. So you have to face-to-face contact and invite them, and so that it isn't just a technology thing. I mean, that comes after. I mean, we're very technologically advanced. It's just that it's nice to see a face. So that's one way to start building relationships.
Good point, yes.
Hello, I'm Russell Willis Taylor from BAM Center, and I have the great honor and privilege of working with Brian. And I just wanted to, we were encouraged by Robert Foster yesterday that this is a place where we learn from one another and news is broken. So I just wanted to use this opportunity to say welcome to Reneltta, who at the end of, or the latter part of the autumn, will become our new Director of Indigenous Art at BAM Center.
Now you have to do a performance.
Yeah, could I just say also, it's not only Mother's Day, Reneltta gave birth a year ago today, and it's her birthday. So I think...
Wow.
We did a summit together, and it was my birthday during the summit. That was like the best.
Awesome. Hi, Ed Lance here. There was some mention about participatory, culture, or being part of maybe Indigenous arts, and I'm wondering, sort of the Western embodiment of, the proscenium stage, and everybody sitting politely and applauding, and how are there other forms of theatrical production or participatory sorts of arts that you guys have explored?
No.
That's easy
But
enough.
I'm just going to touch on a bit of what my colleague here said, and it's really down to the destruction of our families. That is what I've experienced in the Indigenous community, and because our families have been destroyed to some degree, and I really feel like investments in the arts and experience in the arts are led by parents. And so when our parents don't have the capacity or the knowledge to take those kids, to introduce them to the arts, to spend money on training and lessons and stuff like that, we lose that. And so again, we have access in a lot of First Nations to the POW and the participatory experience, and so I think that's kind of our default right now is that. And I think we just need to introduce more gateways to the arts and more gateways to to theaters and music and dance, and I think we'll see a little bit more growth. But at the same time, I always felt bad as a presenter at Aboriginal Music Week forcing Indigenous audiences to change, and so I think we need to have a discussion about that. Is it our role to force Indigenous people to change even more, or do we, as arts presenters, need to change the way that we engage Indigenous audiences?
Maybe I'll just speak briefly to that. We have, at the National Arts Center, we have no way of knowing whether the works will happen on our stages or will happen in communities or will be a mixture of both, whether it will happen in our lobbies, whether it will happen along the canals, whether it will happen entirely on the stages. We're certainly open to the advent of any number of different ways in which it could be expressed, and certainly our experience has shown that there are many different ways. Heather Morris here, she led the northern scene, and personally for me, one of the most exciting nights of theater I've ever participated in was a fashion show that happened all through our lobby spaces, which was extraordinary, with DJs and a whole mixture of different performers bringing different skills to the night. So I think there will be a huge change in the ways in which we receive the work.
And just one thing that we did last year before one of the shows is we decided to kind of just organize a friend-raiser. So we invited about 160 Indigenous and non-Indigenous influencers and elders all to have dinner together with 3 top chefs, 1 Indigenous and 2 non, and even just adding a few layers of opportunities for dialogue and for reconciliation. And that's now, basically launched a bit of a dinner series that we're experimenting with. So I think that we need to just be open to other ways to engage this very powerful vehicle of the arts to get people talking and get mainstream people engaged in the conversation.
And also dissemination of space. I just want to really plug, it's vital that there are spaces for art in the communities. Like if we go up north, and I do youth outreach in each community, there's a hockey rink or a sports arena, but in none of those communities is an art center or an art space to create art. And I know specifically that Nunavut and Akariwit is looking for an art space to create art. They have a very strong, powerful performance art company, collective, and it's also making room to create space. I mean, theater in itself is a sort of a colonized profession, but we are strong and we are adapters. We are like we are the most adaptive people in this country. I really believe that. And so asking for space, I think, is also quite vital. So when you think about, it isn't just transforming space, it's actually creating and making space as well.
Okay, yep, and you're next, okay.
Hi, my name's Jennifer Mattituck. I'm an invited contributor from Dunlop Art Gallery in Saskatchewan. And I'm going to try not to cry right now. I'm really sorry, but we lost a couple of people as well in the accident that you were speaking of, Michelle Serrata and Lacey Desjardins. And I got to know Michelle quite well. And something that I found really inspiring about her, which connects with the idea of community, which you were bringing up, is that she was so wonderful in terms of I think as institutions, we see ourselves as attractions, and we see ourselves as places that that people are supposed to come to, right? People are supposed to come to us. And what was so beautiful about Michelle and the work that she did as an experimental theater artist is she actually regularly went out to reserves and worked in the communities with the people to develop her work. And I just feel like that's a direction that as institutions, we all need to be moving in. We can't feel like we're where we are and we have to wait for people to come to us. I think we all need to see that it's our responsibility to go out and meet the people where they are. That's it, sorry.
And thank you for raising that, just because Michael and Narcissus were on their way to Piapot Nation with Michelle and Lacey to try to develop a bit of a Making Treaty 4. So thank you.
I just like to touch on partnerships. With Aboriginal Music Week, our key was partnerships with Indigenous organizations throughout the Winnipeg's lower income neighborhoods. And so as a person with production experience and presentation experience, marketing, and able to fill out grant applications. I was able to partner with these organizations who have ties to the community and able to engage the local neighborhood, and I think that's where our strength was. And so taking the arts to the neighborhoods we had way more people engaged than putting up something in downtown Winnipeg at a nice performing arts center and waiting for people to come to us. It just didn't happen. And so, again, I think partnerships are key. So if you guys are interested in engaging Indigenous audiences, I think that's a big part of it, taking the arts to the family so they can walk and they can have that first introduction, that first gateway.
Thank you. This gentleman first, and I'll go there, and then we'll get a microphone for that lady at the doorway as well.
Hi. I'm not sure the best place to direct this question, and I'm also not exactly sure how to phrase it, but we've spent about the past 2.5 years and quite a bit of money, so a lot of time and I think fairly well-resourced on what we're considering our first crack at a reconciliation project. We did work very hard to create a collaborative team, the majority of which are Indigenous artists and producers. But some of the work and some of the legwork on the project does fall into non-Indigenous people, and we wanted to have that collaborative spirit. But sometimes we are presenting the project either to a broadcaster or to another funding organization or to different community members. And we're sometimes getting the question, what's a white person telling the story for? They don't know, obviously, the amount of time and work that we have done. I'm not saying that we did it perfectly or anything like that, but certainly we tried to do it with a very collaborative spirit and have an Indigenous-led project. But we didn't want to hand it over. It was our reconciliation work. We wanted to go through that process. But I don't always feel like I know the right answer to that question. What's a white person doing telling the story? I mean, we're telling it in as collaborative a way as possible. But I'm assuming you encounter that dynamic a lot on both sides of this divide, and I'm interested in advice and the experience that you have on that issue.
Great question. That's, of course, very timely, too, with a whole lot of things that have happened across the country. Mike, you want to take the first stab?
That's actually a really solid question, and it's and I mentioned this. It's called "Who's Your Audience?" I call this "Who's Your Audience?" I've done my first real experience with a non-Native person writing a play specifically with Indigenous people and an Indigenous inspiration was Night by Christopher Morris. It did extensive. We toured with it for 4 years. 5 years, I joined it the second go-round. And it was Human Cargo Theatre. And he spent 7 years in Pond Inlet working with a group of Inuit writing a play. And and in the play, it's very dark, 90 minutes, no intermission. It had suicide. It was basically dealing with suicide, substance abuse, and incest. It was like everything. And it was widely successful. And we toured it both in the northern communities and in the southern communities. So we did all the major festivals. We did Push. We did all these great festivals. And then we went to the north to the communities of like Cape Dorset, Kugluktuk, Yellowknife, several. And then Greenland and Iceland after that. And this is where I really believe that the voice is very gray. I don't feel like you should only write your own stories, but I feel like you absolutely have to have process. He spent 7 years in Pond Inlet when he wrote that play. He didn't just come up with an idea down south and then write it. He also, with some cajoling from me, brought it to Pond Inlet so that it could be witnessed by the community. And it was very mixed. And it had to be, right? Because he took that story, a dark story, and then brought it down south, and it did really well. When we went into the other communities outside of Pond Inlet, it was very powerful because it had to deal with suicide. And you were watching Inuit people on stage speaking Inuktitut. And And what would happen is people would stand up and ask for their youth to talk to them. The community engagement was very strong. And it created a space to be able to talk about real issues. And both Christopher and myself got suicide prevention training before we went on tour so that we could engage, if we got engaged as artists, that we were able to, offer some sort of support and provide support within the community, like to guide support for in the community. And when we went down south, the main question was, what right do you, Christopher Morris, to tell this story because you're a white person? And it's a southern audience and the northern audience are very, very different. The northern audience engaged with, we see you on stage, we're dealing with these very real issues right now, and now we have a space to talk about them. And now Night is done in the school system. It got published, and now they're doing it in the school system, and they're telling their own stories, their own perspective, their own way, and that's what's vital. I think you have to really consider who's your audience, who are you doing it for, and then ask yourself how much of this, how do we engage with that? Like with Stratford, it's a Stratford audience, and I think what's really poignant about the breathing hole is that the audience that's going to see this play is exactly the audience that should see this play. And that's what I think is really important. So I don't want to dissuade you from being a spearhead in creating these projects because you're not Indigenous, but you have to include Indigenous perspective. You have to have Indigenous-led projects as well. Maybe it's finding a balance where you lead this one, but then you create space for it to be Indigenous-led the next time. There is that balance. Mentorship, there's lots of places to do that.
Thanks. Did you want?
Yeah, I'll
A quick comment, and then we'll go there.
yeah, just to support that idea. I know in the healing and health and wellness movement in Indigenous communities, we had always suspected that Indigenous people wanted the opportunity to go to elders and use sort of traditional cultural means of dealing with things like mental health. And we find that that's not the case. I mean, they're perfectly comfortable going to Western psychiatrists and psychologists and using elders and healers, and it's sort of a blended kind of a response. And so that's often referred to at least in that industry, as two-eyed seeing, one Western and one Indigenous. And the idea of blending those two things into a sort of a joint cultural response. And I think you're exactly right. There's far more sensitivity sometimes in the non-Indigenous community to this appropriation idea than there is to Indigenous people who are just happy to have their stories told. So, and just a previous comment is that the ways that our communities contribute. I think there's also this sense that there's a reticence or there's a shyness or to tell our stories and to contribute to public processes or art processes or these sorts of things. In my experience, and I mean hundreds and hundreds of communities and consultations and things like that, all you have to do at the end of an evening is say, does anybody have a comment? Just line up at the mic and you're there for hours. I mean, people are not afraid to tell their stories. There is, I think, much more so in the Indigenous community, this willingness to say, this is what happened to me. This is my story. I want this out there. I want everybody to hear it. But you're much more likely to get that if you're in a community center in downtown London, Ontario or something. So I think that shared process of storytelling and revealing of sort of your identity, your personal identity, I think it's very, very comfortable in our community, and maybe that's something that we can explore and use more often.
Just want to add one thing, is just make sure you're always empowering Indigenous people along the way. So you're telling an Indigenous story, bring along some Indigenous young people or even older folks that want to get linear practice. I think we're, like Mike said, we're all wanting to express ourselves, and expression is an important part of our personal health and personal well-being. And the arts is, again, here to make the world a better place, so empower Indigenous voices.
Okay.
One more quick one, and then.
Well, I think your question was maybe a little bit more about back of house rather than front of house. Like what's going on in the organization in terms of everything from raising money to having to align with these Western practices that we're so used to and we're pretty good at. And I think this is where it's going to take some time, again, to build capacity so that we are learning from each other. The executives are learning from the artists might be, or the Indigenous might be learning. We can learn together in this process so that, again, walking side by side. So we're in new territory, all of us, and I think we just have to accept that. And sometimes it's not easy. You jump into the lead only because you're used to doing that, which can be perceived as you know, all kinds of things. So it really, you have to be humble, like Reneltta was saying. You've got to be humble when you're working alongside.
Thank you. Question there?
Hi, I'm Kira Lachlan, and I work for the Stratford Festival. And similar to Sarah, first of all, thank you to all of the panelists, and particularly to Michelle and Sarah, who have guided me in terms of the Indigenous work that we've been doing at Stratford. And like Sarah, under what Reneltta said, under Anthony Chomolino's artistic direction, I have been actually producing a lot of the Indigenous work at the festival on many levels. But I have a question. So Sean Atleo, who was then the chief of the Assembly of First Nations, came to Stratford back in 2012, which was when he first introduced to me the idea of the two-row wampum as a current practice for looking at reconciliation. And it took me then, you know, the next 5 years to the last phase of our Indigenous, one of our Indigenous explorations at Stratford, to actually recognize a difference from that perspective to my own, which comes from an immigrant perspective, long time, assimilated 3 generations back, where my Indigenous co-facilitator, Penny Cucci, talked about the two-row wampum being like this, and I realized that in so much of what I expect as a Western-trained mainstream theater practitioner, I think of things like this, as intersections, and learning to create a range of practice that will allow for artists to work within either model or paradigm. So I'm learning about the two-row wampum, and it's really hard, and I also did want to say that to attest to the difficulty of it, in keeping with some of the things that we've learned, and also because he was here in a conversation that we had, I would like to acknowledge the collaboration of Kagiavut and on the process of the breathing hole. And we do make mistakes, and we have made mistakes, and it's hard. It's hard for a mainstream organization to just go sorry, because it's really easy for us to say sorry, and it's really not always us that are paying the costs, and so I don't quite know how to reconcile that. But I did have, my question is around how do, particularly Brian and Alan, because I don't know you, what is the line for you between the adoption of Indigenous protocols within mainstream organizations, things like land acknowledgements or smudgings, versus the development of new protocols that are maybe more intersectional, like how is that appropriate or not appropriate to look for new protocols that can acknowledge the Indigenous roots of those practices with Indigenous guidance. So things like drumming circles at opening night ceremonies, and I'm talking really practical things, or land acknowledgements before live performances. And I always feel, I think that's where I'm currently at with this different modes of thinking. Should we be doing them as settlers, or should we be asking our Indigenous partners to do them? And if they're not available, what do we do? And how, what does it look like to you, the place of protocol and integration of some of these teachings within mainstream organizations?
I think this is a good time to talk about, like, Indigenous people is not this big collective or conglomerate. We're all different. And so you have to talk to the people that are specific to your region, your territory. And I think that's the first step. I don't think there's any, like, pan-Indigenous protocol. And I've even seen this with specific elders. So elders have different ways of approaching stuff. Like at the Winnipeg Folk Festival, I'm a part of the Indigenous Advisory Committee. And so I've learned like we had one elder who wanted to do the opening blessing in front of a large audience. And then we had another elder who thought, this is more personal. I want to do this outside of the stage and not in front of everybody. So I think like you just have to talk to the people in your area and understanding protocols that they subscribe to. I think that's important.
Yes, and there are examples especially universities have really taken up protocols, so you can actually find some examples of protocols online. We're going to have to end it there. I'm getting the hook for us because you still have a little bit of work to do, everyone. About 10-15 minute conversation at your table before we go for lunch. I want to thank all our panel, so if you can help me thank them.